Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today at the Women in Public Policy Program seminar series. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Anisha Asindi. I am the WAP Director of Research and Programs. We're a research center housed at the Harvard Kennedy School, where our mission is to equip leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. And this seminar is one of the ways in which we fulfill that broad and exciting mission. Wanted to share some brief seminar logistics before we begin. If you have any tech-related questions or issues, feel free to post them in the chat or private message anyone who has the acronym WAP in their name. There's a few of us on the team who will be moderating and supporting today. For the question and answer portion, the speakers are willing to take questions throughout. We'll ask you to raise your virtual hand, which is in the reactions tab of your Zoom platform, or post in the chat, which I will be monitoring. And finally, before I hand things over to our WAP co-director, Hannah Riley-Bowles, though we are in virtual space today, WAP would like to offer a land acknowledgement to honor local Indigenous communities on the campus that we work on. WAP and the Harvard Kennedy School are located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people, the surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and of the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts. We honor this tradition and work toward a gender equity agenda that addresses the needs of all women, including Indigenous women and Indigenous communities. And with that, I will pass it to Hannah Riley-Bowles.
Thank you, Anisha. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see our room filling up and to see so many familiar names. We're thrilled you're here with us for what will be a terrific talk. I'm WAP's co-director, Hannah Riley-Bowles. Welcome to our fall Women in Public Policy Program research seminar, which is focusing on women's leadership in context, gender, power, and identity dynamics. So what we'll be doing in this series is giving participants an opportunity to engage with cutting-edge research on contextual factors that influence women's leadership advancement, including organizational structures and practices, power dynamics, and intersectional identities. So today we are pleased to welcome Professors Monica Higgins and Jenny Miles Weiner, presenting on Reclaiming Power in a Feminized Profession, Women's Leadership K through 12 Education. Monica is the Kathleen McCartney Professor of Education Leadership at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her work focuses on leadership and organizational change. She's fascinated why people and systems are resistant to change. And today, Jenny is a professor of educational leadership at the University of Connecticut. Her scholarship focuses on issues of leadership and organizational change, and particularly the impact of gender and racial discrimination in educational leadership. And so they're going to share with us some insights from a really terrific book about Lead Her Ship, which examines the feminized nature of the education profession as their context, and then thinks about and will get us thinking about what are the implications of that context for women's potential to step into and thrive in leadership positions. So we are so thrilled to have both of you here, so grateful. And what they're going to do is they are educators. They are leaders in education. So needless to say, they're going to engage us in as much interaction as we can collectively pull off. What we propose is that you put questions and comments in the chat. I think Jenny's going to lead the presentation. Monica and Anisha will be watching the chat. We'll pull Monica as well into the discussion. And so please keep your thoughts and questions running as the talk progresses so that we all get in as much hybrid conversation as we can. Jenny, may I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen to get us started. Can you give me a thumbs up that it's working so I know? Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having us. It's really a thrill and to be amongst people who are interested in this topic and care so deeply about these issues. Before we get started, I also just wanted to acknowledge all the women who have honored us and trusted us to share their stories. So much of what we're going to be talking about is based on qualitative research and what I would say is like the radical truth telling of women in these positions about their lived experiences in this particular context. And I just want to honor them by naming them and sharing that we wouldn't be here today if they had not chosen to share their stories with us.
Okay, so well, to move the focus away from us, we are going to get us hopefully warmed up. So Monica.
Yeah, so great. Welcome, everybody. It's terrific to be here and to be in conversation with you. We are super comfortable with the chat flying. So you just go ahead. You can say hi to people. Definitely appreciate you chiming in about the sound. I didn't know that it was on my end. So we're just going to warm up a little bit to get you into the context. So as Hannah said, your entire series is focused on different contexts. Our context is primarily, it's certainly education. We're both professors in education schools. And we're going to be focusing, our book focuses on K-12. In addition, though, we're going to add in, a little bit of data and from what we know in higher ed, because we know some of the audience members are actually working in higher ed contexts. But you have to kind of wrap your head around this particular context, even from your own lived experience and or from where you're working. So I'm just going to start off with, so Jenny has shared this one screenshot, which, Secretary Cardona said, teachers are nothing short of heroes. And you have all these pictures there. And then there are 3 questions. And what I'd love for you to do is just, how about responding just to the first 2, whichever one you like? When you think about K-12, so that's kindergarten through the 12th grade, which is in the United States, kind of before you go off to, say, a higher ed institution or do something else, vocational. I'd love for you to just answer, either the first or second question. What does hero mean in the context of K-12 education? Okay, so just throw some things into the chat. You could also choose the second question. What are some of the things educator heroes are expected to do? Are these activities normal in other industries? Why or why not? So just throw some stuff into the chat just to get us warmed up as, just trying to kind of fall into the context here, because that's where we're going to live for the next hour or so. So I see some great comments about, going above and beyond, being selfless, sacrificing, empathetic, playing this dual role, maybe more than 2 roles, motivating people to learn who may not want to learn. That's perhaps heroic, superhuman. Yes, teachers who care for children, who fight for those who face difficulties, deal with aggressive children. Oh, yeah. Let's not forget the paperwork that they have, right? All the administrivia, right? Always available, always good nature, ever patient. These are fantastic comments. There's so many things that in the context of education, educators, teachers, staff people might need to do or think that they need to do or others expect them to do. Okay, third question now. How might these activities relate to the stereotyped idea that women or most educators are quote unquote caring? Well, they're caring, they contribute to humanity, of course, right? Yes, Anna, directly aligned with the maternal stereotype. I see people like that. Don't do it for the money. That relates to an earlier comment about teaching as a calling, right? It's kind of coming out of you. You must care, involve putting themselves last and others first. These are terrific comments. Thank you so much. Okay, Jenny, I feel like we're warmed up.
What's really useful to start to noodle on here is that there are so many things here that are worthy of our celebration and facilitate, right? Like why we become educators. I was a K-12 educator myself, the kind of value system that is beautiful, right? Like to care, to love, to share. The question is, right, whose choice is it? And when does what we elevate disconnect from what is actually valued institutionally, right? So there's some questions to be asked about why it is that women are meant to be without self in this space and also not get compensated at levels, right, that any other career or profession may be compensated, given how much they give, right, and all the wonderful things that you put forth. So I want us to kind of be percolating on how we can hold both of those things at the same time and make sense of them within the context of a feminized profession. So I just wanted to give an agenda. This is what we're going to talk about, but I just want to take a minute and talk about what do we mean, because I think it's important. So why did we write this book in the first place? And I think this goes to context, which is that, I had the privilege as does Monica to speak to many powerful women leaders. And we would go around and I would be shocked by them telling stories, constant stories about being put down, diminished, right? Feeling less than, being told that they're not effective. And they were ashamed. There was a lot of internalization and a lot of shame about those kinds of feedback that they were receiving. And most of the feedback that they got to kind of handle that was about how they should change themselves, right? How they should twist themselves, be less aggressive, be more aggressive, be like less emotional, be more emotional. And they really didn't have an outlet to talk about this at scale or with one another. And again, when I would go around and talk to people and ask them questions about how many books they've ever read in a leadership course, I mean, these people have gone through 20 years of leadership prep. Never a woman, right, author, never a woman of color, never a person of color, and very few faculty members who match those descriptions either, right? So there was this sense that there was a neutrality about leadership when in fact, right, we all know that identity matters relative to how we were received in this world and how people experience us and also our ability to thrive. So we really wanted to attend to that by sort of giving this book and creating opportunities for women to have this sort of radical truth telling, but also to give some frameworks and ways of thinking about it that wasn't just about individuals changing themselves. And then the second thing I just want to clarify is when we say women, what do we mean? And what do we mean by leadership? So often, particularly when, I'll speak to my own lived identity, someone like me talks about women, we usually are talking about white women. And this book is not about that, right? We talk about women. We talk about women of different racialized identities, predominantly Black women, which is whom I've done a lot of my research with. But again, I just wanted to clarify that because it's important within our context, because still today, as we'll talk about, teaching is predominantly not only a feminized profession, but a white profession.
Jenny invited me down to, she's, as Hannah was saying at the beginning, she spends a lot of her time in Connecticut. She has a group of superintendent women that she gets together with. And I had the opportunity to come down and present some research. And afterwards, as Jenny was saying, we'd often hear these women, sitting around and kind of talking about their experiences. And I saw, the snaps to, feedback to be more aggressive, less aggressive at the same time. It's exactly in the chat. That's exactly, you're hearing these sorts of things. You're like, oh my goodness, but there is research that we can draw on. So just as a way of understanding, we're going to take a small slice in this book, but the book is organized so it kind of gives you the research, drops you into the context via a case, asks the reader some questions about the case, and then diagnoses the case. And so, pulling from the research, we do know some things about this. Obviously, you all, just many of you in the audience do from your own lived experience. We know from research and giving you the case so you have the context, you can kind of marry the two. So that was around the why this book. I just wanted to add that in and also give a sense of the organization of the book. We're just going to be focusing on a narrow slice, but
thanks, Monica. Sorry, everybody. Hopefully, if it happens again, I'll take off my headphones. But the other thing I just want to say, when we're talking about leadership, we talk about administration, but this is really an opportunity to think about whenever a woman is trying to exert leadership within the context. So that can be informal or formal. So that's all I wanted to say there. So in terms of just the numbers, to give us some grounding, right? As I said before, most teachers in America continue to be women, almost 80%. All right. But inversely, only about half of principals, 54%, are women. Now, this doesn't look the same across the leadership trajectory. The littles, meaning elementary school, like kindergarten through 6th grade, there's much higher proportionality of women who lead those schools. So it's about 56 to 60% of principals at the elementary level are women. Middle school is more like 40%, and high schools is about 34%. That's important because most high school is the predominant way for leaders to move from leadership at a school level to move to a district level. So you can understand, right? Inversely, we can imagine there's 20% of teachers that identify as male, but almost 80%, 70 to 80% of superintendents are male, right? So clearly something is happening across that trajectory. Now, I just wanted to stop here a minute and also mention, right, like it is very difficult from the National Archives to get information that looks at intersectional identities, right? It is almost impossible. In fact, a student who was working for me had to call IES for 2 years to get them to run the numbers, which tells you some indication of how important they think this issue is, right? Looking at women of color and their lived experiences, but it's also, right, something that we need to be attending to. So when we look at the number of principals who identify as Black women, it's only 7% in America, right? Latinas only represent about 6% of principals in the United States. This is public schools. And less than 1.4% of superintendents in the United States identify as Black women. It's virtually impossible to get other ethnic backgrounds or racialized backgrounds around that, but it helps us understand, right, like the scope of the issue and what's happening across the domain. So similarly, I just wanted, this is our academic sidebar, which I'll pass to Monica, and that the numbers don't look so much better within academia.
Yeah, I mean, I as we said, this is primarily a book that's focused on K-12, but of course, higher ed, a lot of you are in higher ed. It's very interesting to see, and perhaps not at all surprising, that, women make up about 50% of all full-time faculty, but check this out. In terms of who's on the tenure track and who's not, we have about 54% of women are non-tenure track. So obviously these are less powerful positions. These are not the voices that get the vote in the room. And so lower status, and it's similar. It's similar. I mean, in K-12, and I don't have the numbers and the salary differences, maybe you do, Jenny, but the numbers in terms of being in K-12, a principal versus a teacher are staggering. You don't have to wonder about whether there's, a significant difference in the salary. It's massive. But anyway,
and yeah,
higher ed, same thing.
Is that all ranks of in the academy, women make less. And actually, they make less at the higher ranks, more so. Once you're in the same rank, the higher ranks, you make less as well. So that's true. And the same thing is true within the education field, is that as you move further away from teaching, even within unionized spaces, the differential becomes larger and larger as you move up between male and female. There's also, just on this note too, if you look at the racialized breakdown too, right, only 5% of tenured faculty are Black and 6% are Latinx within bachelor granting institutions. And it's about 4% and 4.6%, which when those with doctoral. Also, the numbers are, as you move up in terms of ranking from assistant to associate to full, we're going from about 60% of the faculty being represented as women to about 30% at the highest ranks. And only about 30% of college presidents identify as women. So again, we're seeing sort of similar trends in terms of where people are or aren't, for that matter. So I just want to talk about a couple of phenomena to help us understand this. And one of them, I think, relates directly to this question of the heroicism that we were talking, and I'm using that in quotes, that we were talking about before. And this is the idea of feminization. So I just want to clarify that feminization, like, what does that mean? Well, it means that within any given industry, right, that we know something is being feminized or moving towards feminization when there are more women in that particular industry. So we might say nursing, teaching, right? I said 80% already. It can also be an industry in which you had a predominantly male workforce that's now moving into a feminized workforce. But there's more to it than just more women being there, right? There's also this concept that the kind of work that is being elevated tends to align with feminized stereotypes: caring, selfless, kindness, maternal instinct, so on and so forth, right? It also aligns with additional scrutiny. So more inspection, more sort of external control. We might think about sort of the neoliberal orientation of the accountability systems, right? Like, in fact, Michael Apple from Columbia, who talks about the history of teaching, talks about this idea that women, like one of the ideas of why we have teacher evaluations is because women need to be inspected and they cannot be trusted, right, to have this level of control over young people, particularly in, right, higher levels of learning. And again, lack of autonomy related, right? Another feminized principle is that there would be lesser rewards, and that can either be sort of psychic rewards, but also fiscal rewards, right? So if we look at differentials in pay, we notice whether women are concentrated, they often are paid less as well. And finally, right, rhetoric around the value of professionalism around that particular field, right? So somebody had written that in the chat, not valued as much. Right. So we can say, wow, you're so lucky to be a teacher. You have your weekends off, your summers off, you get off early. Is it really a profession? Anybody can do it, right? We can just create a policy, for example, in Florida, where you receive no training, but you were a veteran and you can be in front of kids teaching the next day. Right. Just think about what other industries would allow or facilitate that kind of entry, right? Other than those that are traditionally feminized. So again, we start to see and can kind of understand, right, how we get this picture or this idea of this heroic, right, teacher, but the heroicism, again, is situated in not asking for anything, right, and giving everything. So I think it's really important that we have this sort of, this kind of cultural norm or ideas about like our work, and I say our because I was a teacher myself, right, being the baseline from whence, right, people are coming and leading and thinking about that. I also wanted to say, and this is some work that I'm doing currently, that feminization can operate sort of horizontally and vertically. So vertically is this idea that, you know, women have sort of like men are principals, women are teachers, men are doctors, women are nurses, right? But it can also operate horizontally. And what I mean by that is if we think about in academia or even the medical field, I just spoke to a bunch of women in academic medicine. They're highly concentrated in pediatrics, gynecology, right? And men tend to be concentrated in surgery. I'm trying to think of some of the other specialties that were highlighted. Definitely surgeons was one of them. More of the internal medicine, other kinds of things, right? So again, so I used to say, teaching is feminized, leadership is not. And I've revised that to say, we allow women to lead in particular strands of leadership, i.e. the elementary school where we have little ones, not the high school where it's serious business, right? And the work that I'm doing now, you saw the numbers around almost 30% of superintendents being men, but almost 90% of directors, assistant superintendents, of directors of special services, those are the people who handle students with special needs, homelessness, nursing, right? Those Title IX, which is our stuff around gender discrimination, identify as women. They also make about $75,000 on average less than any other district employee of the ones that I've been speaking to in Connecticut. So, right, again, when we start to wonder and think about this, I think it's a very useful framework for us to understand why we're in the place that we are. Monica.
Oh, Jenny, I was just going to add something if you go back one slide and also call out, you know, Erin's comment, the devaluing of this feminized professions linked to the devaluing of children as well. I mean, what a statement there. I was just going to say, you know, some of our data or the data that we're drawing on is pre-COVID times. And if you think about this hero model, it's got to be amplified, right? Teachers are our heroes. Look what they did during COVID times. And yet, do you notice much has changed? No, absolutely not. That's why so many teachers have been fleeing the profession. So if anything, I think over time, you know, this model has gotten reinforced and reified.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Monica.
Oh yeah, look at Beth's comment. My goodness. Yeah, now the teacher is the protector too, given all of the shooting events, horrible tragedy in our schools.
So another framework that I wanted to kind of introduce, or we introduced within the context of the book, which I think is useful, is this idea of ambivalent sexism. Of course, Monica and I were talking about it's not ambivalent, right? We were like, maybe it's ambidextrous as opposed to ambivalent. But the idea here is that oftentimes when we think about how sexism manifests within the context of, with any context, right? We talk about what's happening on the left. So they sort of argue this is hostile sexism. It's more familiar. It's the kind of stick, right? Which is this idea that, women are not smart, not capable. They're not, leadership material. And how we enforce those kinds of stereotypes, because of course, stereotypes are descriptive, but they're also proscriptive in that they attempt to control people's behavior, not simply, right, define it, is through domination, right? Put down, punishment for violations. And I think in some ways, right, like our traditional ideas about discrimination, and in fact, within the context of the legal system, really fit this model, right? What is less attended to, and I think is sort of, again, like going crazy within a feminized profession, is the use of benevolent sexism. So this is the idea, right? Women have a particular place, a particular understanding of who women are. And this stereotype elevates caretaking, emotional, caring, maternal, right? And instead of sort of punishment, right, the response and the way to elevate this is to put on a pedestal, as it does in this picture, but also to reinforce and reward those behaviors. Now, I want to use this word reward a little carefully, because as I said before, it's not necessarily that you're getting a big paycheck and people are clapping for you, right? Rather, it's a reinforcement that violations of, right, being caring and nurturing are problematic. So we reward you by saying you are a good teacher. Look, you didn't ask for any money and you brought your own supplies from home and you gave them everything that you could possibly give them. You are wonderful. You are a wonderful teacher, right? Of course, you're missing out on quite a few things, perhaps your own child's birthday, right? Your salary, your ability to like have a living wage, but you are matching our vision of these kinds of forms of benevolent sexism. So I think this is important, again, not to diminish these behaviors, right? Like these are they're important, and nobody wants to work in a place where no one cares for each other or cares for kids, but rather that they are not institutionally valued, right? And then that shapes who we view as being able to succeed or lead or be in this space. So it gets operationalized within the context of our work, right? So if you haven't read the No Club, I would recommend it highly. But basically, care work and this kind of benevolent sexism gets operationalized. So every year, women spend almost 200 hours more than men on work tasks that will not help them get promoted or otherwise advance their careers, right? They're asked to do 44% more than men in unrewarded work, and they are 50% more likely to say yes to that work, right? And so here are some quotes from the women that we spoke to, Francesca being one, who is a teacher leader and spent much of her time supporting her colleagues, helping them, right? The frequent flyer children who needed more support, stepping in when others couldn't. And none of this was paid. It was valued in the sense that she felt a sense of personal satisfaction, uplift from helping, but she had dreams of being an administrator, and none of this could be put on a resume or was an official position or was compensated, and in fact took her away from being able to fulfill other parts of her job that officially, right, could support her in moving up. Similarly, and this is something I hear from many women, or we hear from many women over and over again, is that this is used to manipulate women, right? This idea of care. So when there is an opportunity for growth or to move up or to move out, much of the narrative that they receive about, right, violating this norm is that they have somehow turned their back on the children that need them, their community, right? So many women who go through this opportunity for a promotion tell us that people are complaining to the end, like, how could you do this to us? How could you turn away from us? How could you ask for more money? You know what it looks like right now. And this is not a phenomenon, right, often that I hear happening to male colleagues in the same space. Monica, do you want to add anything before I move to the next one?
Oh, I was just going to say, I feel like we're rounding out the vocabulary here on different forms of sexism as it relates to this particular context, but I don't think it's specific to this particular context. I mean, if you think about, people getting promoted up and out, the extent to which women are often told, yeah, you're going to miss them, but the kind of like the kids are going to miss you. That sort of thing kind of really makes the heart ache, and people know it, as opposed to the congratulations. I certainly have seen it. So that's in higher ed. But the other thing I just wanted to point out is that some of this, yes, benevolent guilt tripping, I love that, Beth. I don't love it, but I like the term, is when we think about caregiving, Jenny and I were talking about, so I haven't worked in K-12, but my second daughter was a teacher all through COVID times. And she was just telling me about a recent experience in which she was leading a professional development session for lots of teachers. And it's a big global organization, nonprofit that she now works for. It's climate action. It's, it's a great job for her. And she's working with teachers, and she was expected to bring the coffee. And I said, really? You're bringing the coffee and all these other materials, and you're getting the room set up, and why are you bringing the coffee? And she's like, oh, that's just what we do. And I just what you do, women bringing the coffee and that, or the donuts or whatever. And so the caregiving flips into kind of these other activities that seem really minor, but they can add up and take time, as Jenny was saying, away from, the core work. And so when we look at higher education, we definitely see that. So Jenny, I was going to share some data on this. Okay, so Jenny has this terrific slide. This is higher ed. And it's definitely the case based upon this research, which again, it's adjacent work. Ours is focused on K-12, but women receive more frequent requests to engage in service than men. Their service roles are often more time consuming. And why do you think women are asked? Just throw it in the chat. Why do you think women are asked to do kind of more administrative service sorts of roles? Why do you think? Women tend to do a disproportionate share of service. Why do you think? This is higher ed. Because we're good at it. Yep. Oh, there you go. Underrepresentation. Fits the stereotype. We won't say no. Yep. Yeah, some of these answers, at least from this researcher here. Yep. We want to diversify a committee, right? So, here you go. So I thought I would share with you just off slide, because I have permission to do so, some research that was done at Harvard. And I was told to make sure you all knew that this was from 2019, and that the person who conducted this massive climate survey across the entire university said, it's not going to look as good in post-COVID, okay? So one of the things that Jenny mentioned in K-12 is that the extent to which you're asked to do all these other things takes away from the core work that you would need to do in order to get promoted. So when this survey asked respondents, faculty, and they break it out, men and women and people of color, underrepresented groups within the faculty, what is the greatest source of work stress? Time to do research remained the top work stressor in 2013, 2007, and 2019. Female and underrepresented minority faculty report higher levels of stress across most domains, especially in teaching and service-related responsibilities. So they're asked to do more, significantly more, and they're more stressed because they don't have time to do research. Now, the other piece, which I think just relates to one of the comments in the chat about the extension of housework. How about that? So they also asked about work-related duties, which I thought you might find interesting. Men and women work the same hours, but women with young children spend more time on household duties. This is with respect to outside work. Faculty report sleeping about 7 hours a night, which was surprising to me, but okay. With no notable gender differences among those with young children. Men, though, report spending 3 or so more hours per week on leisure activities than women, regardless of the age of the presence of children. Finally, I just want to report on the feelings of inclusion. So to the extent, this is a little bit ironic, I thought, to the extent that you have women in positions, service-related positions, in higher ed, where you might actually be looking at things like DEIB, et cetera, and you might want to diversify a committee. Interestingly, around this topic of feelings of respect and inclusion, this is what they found. Perceptions of respect and inclusion differ by rank, gender, and race and ethnicity. Of note, tenured women and underrepresented minority faculty are the least likely to agree with statements of inclusion and respect, the least likely. For example, there's a feeling of community in the school. In my workplace, everybody's treated with respect. I just find that kind of interesting, that you're placed on these committees, maybe because you have the inside look, et cetera, and so on. Basically, the long story short is same in higher ed, and this pressure to be representative and to sit on different committees is actually taking away from time, if you're tenure track, to focus on the core work. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, and I think just to build on what you said too, the recent AAUW numbers say that on average, about 70% of men, tenured professors, have children, and only 44% of women have children. So that tells a story as well, in terms of who feels that that's a viable for them, whatever their choices may be, which are always valid. Again, I think what Monica brings up and what I want to say is important relative to thinking about women and their trajectory into leadership and trying to understand the broken rung that I showed you at the beginning, is that, again, these are valuable things, right? They're obviously important relative to ensuring that a school or a place of business, right, are operating in ways that are effective, efficient, and people want to go to work and be there. But they have been invisibled, right? They do not show up in terms of the institutional reward system vis-a-vis their evaluations, their pay, their way and ability to put it on their resume. And that's systematic, right? So we're telling women more of this. And then when push comes to shove and it's time for a promotion or desire to move up or what have you, we say you don't have the right set of skills to do this particular next job, right? Or we don't consider that work of value, even though, of course, it would be relative to leading effectively within our particular context. So I think that that's really important. And also, Monica brought up the second shift, but more women are working outside the home than ever before and are the primary breadwinner than ever before in history of the United States. And they do more home-based labor than they did in the 1960s on average. So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna, little comic relief since we've been telling you all sorts of bad news here. Can I share my screen for a sec?
Sure, I think you can just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I just tried to. Here we go. This is a little funny that was given to me. Can you all see that? Yeah, it's all significantly less impressive once you realize these guys had free childcare. So, I'm sharing this because the context actually isn't often taken into consideration. Carry on.
Right. And over something like 1 million teachers had children under the age of 5. So, and that was true during COVID, just as it's true now. So again, they have childcare challenges themselves as their own children, as they take care of other people's children during the day. The other way that this idea of care, and I would say, benevolent sexism manifests within the context of schools is operationalized is through emotional labor. Sometimes you do animation, you don't know why. But when we talk about emotional labor, right, everybody has to do a little bit of it, right? Like this idea that somehow there is a disconnect between the way in which my emotional state manifests within the context of work and how I truly feel. I truly feel a lot of things a lot of the time that I probably can't share with everyone. And that would be true no matter where I worked. But the question is, we call that surface acting, right? Like there's kind of norms and we know we have to do it. But what we find is that women are involved in far more what we say deep acting. And deep acting is when there is a higher level of disconnect between how you are anticipated or must perform and the kind of emotional arrows and things that are being thrown at you, right? So we have this idea that women are being over because of that care work, right? Because of using so much of their time in ways that doesn't belong to them, by filling in all the gaps with all their fingers, right? In the dam, they're more depleted and they're more often, right, likely to have to engage in this kind of deep acting, right, which is draining in and of itself and enervating. This can be particularly true, right, if you are facing not just gender discrimination, but racial discrimination simultaneously, gendered racism. And this idea, right, so not only are you being attacked for presenting in feminized ways or not feminized enough, but you may also be being attacked in the case of Samantha, right, who happens to identify as a Black woman, for being, right, too racially conscious. Right. So they invited her to be on a DEI committee. She has to deal with them saying that her contributions are not valuable, right? Even though they asked her there to be part of it. So there would be representation. And then she has to be able to carry that kind of emotional drain, which we know leads to stress responses, physical and right. So psychological damage to the person who has to endure those kinds of microaggressions and yet still has to show up every day, right? In efforts probably not to reinforce stereotypes to which they do not want to adhere. So we have this kind of, right, like this kind of dualistic way of really operationalizing this idea of benevolent sexism within this space in ways that's even more true, particularly, again, when you're dealing with children, when you're dealing with colleagues, and so on and so forth. So it can become very, very difficult. And also sends message about what we are allowed and what we are not allowed to do, so that the parameters and sort of stretch of acceptable behavior become extremely narrow and very difficult to negotiate based on who you are within that space and in that context. Monica.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in another piece of research that some of you might find interesting around a different kind of caretaking that goes on, and it's a different profession, but it's people who, women doctors, and how they engage in what's called status leveling. And these authors of an Administrative Science Quarterly issue that came out in 2022, and we can definitely get the link for you, but it's Teresa Cartador, Patrick Hill, and Argavan Sales, who found that women doctors often were in the position, say during, I don't know whether it was during surgeries or whatever, but it was interviews and during patient care, of upward lifting, or oftentimes the term is upward voicing, nurses' ideas, why to try and status level so that the nurses who are, often women, felt on the same level as the doctors. And I found this kind of interesting because in the article, they talked about it as an additional kind of management or work burden, whereas I was thinking, oh, this sounds like great management practice, but the extent to which women are often asked to do this kind of status leveling, why? Because it is a male-dominated kind of profession, and it's a status hierarchical, a very hierarchical profession. So same in education, very hierarchical. As Jenny gave the figures, men do tend to dominate. So what's to do about this? We know that in terms of getting ahead in our career, it's a lot more than your competencies. It's also who you know and who you go to for help. So I put in front of you a graphic, and as you can see, the low range graphic where there's a man I guess it's to my left, I'm not sure which way it is to you, I assume it's the same, has kind of two social arenas that he relies on for support, for mentoring support. He goes to people at his employer, and he goes to somebody else through a professional association, whereas women tend to rely on lots of different people from different social arenas. So I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, what do you think is the positive of having, and this is supported by research, the kind of low range network depicted by the man's network? What do you think is the pro? Just put something in the chat. What do you think? Positive. Depth of professional ties, Hannah says. Streamlined. Also potentially diversity within one's profession. Yes, streamlined. Nice. So yes. So here's the thing. Great. Meeting and interacting with those at higher level. Right. So here's the thing. Women do tend to have these, thank you, Mary, more differentiated networks. Men tend to have lower range networks, and they're super efficient. I love that word, streamlined. It's kind of like one-stop shopping. I can talk to you about my career. I can talk to you about all sorts of things. Women tend to go to people within their profession if they can find them to talk about, the issues that they're having. It's a little more tricky, right, to cross gender lines. But for psychosocial support, they might go to the family members. They might go to subordinates. They might talk to somebody who a man would never think about talking to about, just the trials and tribulations of, that are going on at work, because there isn't that opportunity structure where they can go to kind of a superior person from a status hierarchy perspective, who's got that potential to give them that career support, who perhaps is the same along other lines of gender, for example. So it's more work. So I started off with a pro of the male side of the equation. Women, you do get diversity of perspectives, and that can be very helpful, but it's not as streamlined, as you say. It's not as efficient, takes more time. So we're talking about time as a precious resource, and women are spending more of it, not just in order to get ahead from a human capital perspective, getting time to, for example, work on the research, but from a social capital perspective with these broader ranging networks.
Thanks so much, Monica. So, again, we're talking about context here, and it's important to understand this context within. Also, just in terms of the trajectories of women within the context of K-12 education, there's very interesting research by Myung and others that the primary way that people make it to leadership is through a process of tapping, which literally means someone, coming by and saying, I think you would be great at this. You should think about doing it. But of course, right, people tend to tap those who are most like them. And when we see that the numbers of women and, people of color and others in those leadership roles are very small, then we understand, right, why men are moving, we call it the glass escalator, 3 to 5 years from teaching to administration, white women, 8 to 10 years, Black women, 12 to 15 years, right? That also has to do with the sort of over-certification of women and women of color to feel that they are going to be taken seriously as they move up. But again, there isn't the same tapping mechanisms. So when we think about this, right, how can we find perhaps somebody within our network or look for that, or even create our own networks in which we are tapping one another, encouraging one another to do this when we know that that mechanism is a primary way that people are moving up that ladder, right? That isn't as available to women by the demographics of who is in power currently in our space, particularly. So on that note, what next? And then we can go to discussion and Q&A. But, I think one of the issues is that, this isn't, at least where we go and talk, many educators never talk about this, right? Like the idea that because also that narrative of why we do the work we do, particularly at the level of teaching, is so deeply enmeshed with this story of selflessness, right? The story of deservedness, the story of giving, right? And there's a discomfort, even with the women that I was talking about earlier, when I asked them to explain to me why they're the only district level person who makes $50,000 less than anybody else in the room, they were like, but teachers aren't paid fairly, or they run the high school. And I was like, do they work less hours than you? Do they have less specialized skills than you? Right. And that conversation didn't feel comfortable to many about this. Right. So we need to talk about it. We need to name it, and we need to understand how it's manifesting if we're going to sort of be able to treat it as object and work with it. Another thing to think about is, again, care work is not valued, but it is deeply important. And if it is deeply important, then it should be institutionally valued, which means it should show up, right, in the ways in which we reward, discuss, think about our hiring, all those kinds of things. And to be able to do that, we need to see who's actually holding that burden within our institution. Who is doing that work, right? How could we measure it? How could we name it? How could we capture it, right? Because all that undisclosed labor is just making things move and should be named, discussed, rewarded, included, right? And the way we think about leadership and how we think about moving forward. So those are my points, Monica. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I think one of the reasons we wrote the book, honestly, was, nobody's going to change if they don't understand and don't make these facts visible. The nature of the work, the systems and the structures need to change. And we need to notice even our smallest of practices that are embedded in these systems and structures so that, we can change them. So when you notice, people piling on when somebody's leaving a position and saying, oh, we're going to miss you, we're going to miss you, make sure you throw in there, an atta girl, an atta gal, like this is great news for you and for the organization that you're joining. They're just little, I think, micro level practices that we can change, as well as the systems and structures that Jenny is talking about. When we think about mentoring, recognizing that, we're going to need to reach out and across, and it may take a little bit more work. But when you put in place these mentoring systems that reproduce some of these systems and structures, you're actually undermining best practice. So looking for diversity in practice around mentoring, that's something that I've been kind of advocating. And then, I don't know, I think even things that we've done, we've done book talks. We've just taken a chapter and saying, this is a piece that we need to understand and we need to recognize, and we need to reward people for this kind of work that they're doing, and also don't make them feel badly when they leave.
So yeah, we had a case, but I think we can turn to Q&A. Anisha, does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. If folks have questions, feel free to raise your hand in the React function on Zoom, and we can unmute you to ask it out loud, or feel free to add it to the chat if that's easier. Hannah, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, I think I was not being very effective with my reaction buttons or something, but I'm unmuted. Yeah, so this is so fabulous. Thank you guys so much. It's really, it's so important to, as I know you guys talk about the ed school, to make the familiar unfamiliar, to put new lenses on spaces that we're really familiar with, to get them look at different ways. And all of us, whether or not we're working in education, most of us are engaging with it through our family lives and stuff. So it's really eye-opening. I wanted to go back to this question of, which I really love the way you ended up framing it, about the non-promotable tasks, because one frustration I have with that phrase, or sometimes the phrase that's called like housework, is that there's a it's kind of part of that is a diminishment of feminized labor. you know what I mean? It's almost like the people who are doing this are a little foolish, you know, that they're not doing what counts, when actually a lot of that work is, as you describe, really valuable to the organization, right? And so I was just wondering whether along your journeys, you've uncovered any examples of institutional shifts, and I've seen a little bit of this, institutional shifts where there was a more explicit valuation of some of this work that maybe in the past, to use Joyce Fletcher's phrase, has been disappeared. Or I really loved Monica's point about informal practices. And I was reminded of Cecilia Ridgway's work about how status hierarchies are formed in part through the way in which people are treated, through micro interactions. And so I was just wondering if you could elevate some of the examples, maybe institutional or informal, that you've seen that might be able to help value care work and care related values within systems like this.
So
I have a quick,
oh, go ahead, Monica, please.
I have a quick example. I just think, especially since I was sharing the mentoring piece at the end, I actually think, you know, it's kind of interesting how stuff kind of comes back around. You know, mentoring kind of was, you know, people weren't talking about it very much. And I think now we're recognizing, you know, that, you know, people aren't just going to get ahead by their competencies and putting their head down and doing good work. They need support, and not just from one person. So what I've seen is that people are, you know, even informally being asked, who are you mentoring? And it's actually coming up as part of criteria for promotion, that this is somebody who's going to, yes, caretake for the broader good of the institution. And these aren't necessarily juniors. These could be peers. So that's just one thing that I'm seeing. I haven't done any research on it, but I know, because my research on mentoring was from a long time ago, and it is definitely coming back around. People are asking for it. What do you mean by a portfolio, a personal board of directors, a broad network, and how can we put this in place? And then reward for it. That's one thing I'm noticing. But Jenny.
Yeah, I have two examples, one from the higher ed space and one from K-12 space. So in the higher ed space, we are unionized. So I think that, you know, facilitates different kinds of opportunities, including our ability to choose our own merit structure. So what we have done is we now have a transparent system of reporting how we do our care work and service work, which all faculty members have to look at every single department meeting before determinations of additional tasks are being meted out. And we have included that kind of work within the context of merit. It used to be that the only way that you could get merit would be if you did research, like there was a threshold for how many publications you had. And if you didn't meet that, none of the other work counted, which sends some very clear messages, right, about what's institutionally valued, despite the fact that we're supposed to do three strands of work. So I feel like that's made a huge difference in terms of, again, just transparency, the inability for people to simply be given additional tasks without anybody speaking up to it, and also being rewarded. Second, I've been working with the Hartford Public Schools and a couple other school systems around retraining hiring practices and policies. And that includes doing audits of the kind of language that's being utilized within both job descriptions and the hiring. And so we're trying to move away from these ideas that, right, like who would want the job and who wouldn't want the job based on their other familial responsibilities, what's appropriate to ask. Obviously, it's not legal, but people do it anyway. And also around ideas about changing care work and asking people about that kind of work, and you trying to reframe it within rubrics and ways that we're evaluating as things that should be elevated as skill sets that are aligned with leadership. That's in early stages, but I think I'm hopeful, right, that and other kinds of principles will facilitate different kinds of people getting access and making at least the final pool for the pipeline and then beyond. So those are just two small things that we're working on right now.
Those are great examples. Anisha, I'm going to kick it back to you. Are you, are there other, I want to bring in, I have a string of questions, but oh good, Sean's in.
I just asked you to unmute.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful finding and sharing it with us this afternoon. My name is Sean, and I'm at the HKS right now. One of the things that you guys talked about was around women making less, even at a higher ranking position within academia. And I was wondering if you were able to examine that and investigate that. What was the reasoning? Was it like the different departments that they were working at, or the different departments that they were teaching at? What were the factors for this? Thank you.
So I have some intimate relationship with this within my own context. But so they actually had an analysis done of all. So you're absolutely right, Jane, like in terms of the differentials by, right, business school, you're on average going to be making more or less or what have you, but those differentials were stark anyway, right? So on average, people are making more than they would in the ed school. There are also fewer women in some of the higher level organizations, like depending on where you're being, because of that kind of feminized differential. But in my own experience, and when we did a deeper analysis, much of the differentiation actually came in early offers. So presuming sort of like your entry offer, and there were conversations about, even in my own experience, who else I was supposed to be taking care of in my family, and therefore what would be an appropriate starting salary, right? So a presumption that I'm the secondary breadwinner within that context, and other presumptions, not asked presumptions, nothing that was, actually asked of me, but those differentials are huge. So the initial starting salary is a place where things start to go awry. The other thing that came up when I did a deep dive, at least within my own school, is that men were being paid for these additional care tasks that women were not being paid for. So an example would be, I am the coordinator of 2 programs within the context of my school. I never even bothered to ask for money to do that. And then I found out that one of my colleagues who was below me in rank had received a stipend, soft money, that went into his salary, but then became part of his salary for doing that additional task. So not only, so it's in some ways it's even worse, right, than the distribution of women doing some of this non-promotable care work and men not doing it, but rather men are getting compensated for it, at least within the context that I'm in, right? And women were not. So I think there's a lot of factors to it. And then there's just good old fashioned, sexism. But I think a lot of it had to do with the initial pay, and then also how, sort of additional skills compensation were being meted out over time that was not transparent and not part of the normal step and ladder that is part of our own academic system. So that's what I've noticed. But again, I think there's probably much more to unpack. If you're interested in doing that work, I would encourage you. I think we could scare a lot of institutions if people started digging in about what really was going on and why.
I like that that comment about transparency, Jenny. The question about asking is a really powerful one. So Jenny said, I didn't ask, or I hadn't asked. I've seen this over and over again. I just had it personally last week. I was like, really? Wow, okay. So asking, there's asking, people taking the initiative. It's also being asked, right? So rather than us taking the initiative, other people taking the initiative. And there's also the opportunity to ask. Now, and somewhere in this chat, somebody was saying what would be interesting to study. I don't know. I can't think offhand of research that looks at these interstices of time when people do this kind of giving and receiving of, it's coaching, but it's also asking for things. And, I can think of times where a bunch of women faculty, this was a long time ago, noticed that there were certain kinds of long trips, like on airplanes, even, where certain asks were going on. If you're not asked on the long trip to begin with, you don't get the ask time, that time when you can actually ask for the other thing or be asked about the other thing. So some of this has to do with, and I think it's even harder in Zoom times, but I think it would be super fascinating to just look at kind of the opportunities, the kind of time, in which that might actually occur, as opposed to just putting it all to women. Well, you didn't ask, like, when was my opportunity to ask? I wasn't sitting on an airplane. So there's also a question in here. Jenny, I thought you could answer around Kelly's question, who
Yeah,
says,
I wrote that one down. Yeah.
great,
So,
okay.
so the answer is yes, Kelly. And then, so Kelly asks if there's about higher versus lower grades is valued. So, they're unsurprisingly, right, more of sort of the feminized, the caretaking, the nurturing roles. And the lower grades are valued less and considered to be less professional than the content driven higher education, sort of 9 to 12, high school, which also there are much where men are concentrated in terms of teaching is also within the high school setting. So there is, and there are also even research about strands. So again, when I talk about feminization and strands, so, tested subjects, but also subjects like math and science, again, that tend to be more dominated by male faculty, tend to be elevated within the context. It's also why, and that links, I think, Dr. Riley Bowles was saying this at the beginning around, before we got on, but around meritocracy, which is, there are also a lot of questions about who's allowed to teach those particular skills, since those are keystone skills, right? Like if you have access to math, right, there's good information about even your entire college trajectory and your ability to thrive post, and who should be allowed to be the person to make that determination for young people. So there's quite a bit of research on those topics, but of course there could be more.
I see a question here. I'm not exactly sure whether I'm interpreting it correctly, but there are people, I believe, in the audience who work in the for-profit setting. Maybe I'm interpreting this question right. Does any of this ring true for folks who are working in, say, for-profit business, this kind of care work, and, maybe not asking or having the opportunity to ask for what you rightfully should be given, that sort of thing? I mean, yeah. Okay, well, I'm guessing that there are lots of analogies to think about here in other contexts, although we did try and take you into K-12 and a little bit on higher ed, but our book's really focused on K-12. But I would encourage you who are not in K-12 to think about, what's happening in other settings that kind of rings true. Or maybe, I loved one of the earlier comments about kind of where this begins. It certainly doesn't begin when you start your career. And Jenny and I have given this talk where we talk about these stereotypes and so forth, and they start super early on, and so you enter your career and you've already got, other people also have already got it ingrained. Eva has a question, Jenny.
Yeah, I see that. I just want to say one thing about that too, though. One of the things that I find difficult about this, and I think it relates to Eva's question, which is, who is the constituency, external constituency, fighting for women to have greater access to leadership in this field? Like when I think about sort of corporate spaces, I have a friend who has a hedge fund, and they're held accountable by external investors regarding who are their board members, who do they hire, who's on their panel, right? Like all these kinds of things. And people are demanding, right, a sense of greater diversity across multiple domains of who works there and who has access to power. And I just, to me, I wonder to what extent, the public feels emboldened or even interested in ensuring, right, that there is representation across a wide, diverse pool of people within leadership positions within education. I think we don't think about this very much because we see so many teachers being women. So I think, this, how do we get involved? I think, there's many people on this call who could probably run for school board or be on your PTA or make a stink about this or ask questions. I was on a hiring committee for my children's school for their principal. And I think these are ways that even those of us who are interested lay people can push on this issue substantially in ways that I think not all corporate spaces, but many have to be responsible to clients around who works there in ways that I don't think we do as well as we could around schools, even the diversity of the teachers in terms of racial identities and so on and so forth. The other thing I just wanted to say in terms of other recommendations, I think again, to me, low-hanging fruit is really around hiring, because it is still fairly democratic within the context of schools. And yet when I talk to women, and actually any educators around their hiring experiences, they do not follow principles of best practices or equitable practices across any of the phases, whether it be recruitment, hiring, retention, offers, what have you. And I understand that doesn't deal with all of the underlying sort of discriminatory ideas, but again, it's being operationalized through the pipeline. And so I think if I were an educator in a K-12 system, I would try to get myself on as many of those. I'd read Iris Bonnett's book, which is a gift. And then I would try to get on every single one of those committees that I possibly, and maybe read our book too, and try to infuse equitable hiring practices across all of those domains as a starting point. And then, I would do a lot of other things that were perhaps less institutional, but I would recommend that as a starting point. Go ahead, Monica.
Oh, I was just going to add two things. So Jenny addressed the system level. And of course, we do have recommendations in the book. I would say at the micro level, interrupt. Okay. Don't let somebody say, oh, that's just how so-and-so is. I know that, they constantly coming late, constantly not answering their emails. No, interrupt. You notice somebody's voice not being pulled in, you pull them in. Absolutely. And then you ask. You notice something, you ask, you tell your colleague to ask to get credit. That's how we're going to change. I mean, it's definitely at the higher levels, but I don't assume people are necessarily in those positions. So it takes some courage, but we need to do it. Interrupt.
I love this. Thank you so much. What an inspiring and eye-opening presentation. And also that you're leaving us with both these like micro interactional, things that we all can do, as well as institutional practices. It's just so terrific. We're so appreciative of you guys. And yes, go out and buy the book, Lead Her Ship, and read it. It's excellent. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next week, we hope.